Yeah, so thank you, everyone. I think we will see a few more people joining, and welcome everyone. Wishing you a good and successful new year. It's the first Qlik Meetup Vienna in this year, and we will have around 3 weeks to 4 weeks cadence in 2021. So expect more to come. And I'm really happy today to welcome Rob Wunderlich. And I think Rob does not need a lot of introduction to most of you, as if you have ever worked with Qlik community, I'm sure you've met him or found documents uploaded by him, content shared by Rob. So I think he's really one of the most famous people in the community, and he has 2 topics to share today with us. And yeah, with that, I would just give the word to you, Rob, and tell us what you've brought to us today.
Oh, thank you, Christoph. Happy to be here. So I have 2 topics today. One is talking about server-side extensions, specifically a server-side extension that I have created, or I should say copied from somebody else and added to. A server-side extension written in JavaScript. So I want to talk about how to get started with that. But I also want to use that as an opportunity or launching pad to explain and talk about server-side extensions, how they're implemented, and what possible uses you might have for them. So it's a little bit of creativity thinking about why a server-side extension and why you might want one or why you might not. And then I want to take a little time to introduce my Qlik Sense Document Analyzer Pro, which is a product I've been working on for the last 4 months. Many of you might have used one of my free document analyzers over the years. I'm turning it into a full first-class commercial product, so I'd like to do a preview of that, show you the product, and talk a little bit about the release schedule. So let's go ahead and get started. I will try to share my screen. Let's hope this works out the way I want it.
Rob, what we also would appreciate if okay, that you record it. Since you're the host, I think you need to find that little red recording button. That
Correct.
would be great.
As far as I can see, we are currently recording.
Okay.
Yeah, everything is fine.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. So at this point, you should see an opening slide, qcb-qlik-sse. Give me okay, thumbs up. Great. So this is a server-side extension. The Qlik literature also refers to these as analytic connections. Just 2 different words, 2 different nomenclature for the same thing in the literature. So a server-side extension allows you to add new functionality, so new functions to the Qlik script and the Qlik chart expression language. And this works the same in both Qlik View and Qlik Sense. So like a visualization extension in Qlik Sense adds a visualization or extends the capability of your visualizations on the sheet, server-side extension does the same thing for the script and the expression language. So let's go ahead, and I'm actually going to do a brief demo here. And I'll zoom up the screen. Hopefully you can see okay. So here is some traditional, Qlik script. I've got some script. I've got a little function I've written called sort list that actually sorts a list of values, of strings separated by a delimiter, in this case commas, into their alphabetical order. So you notice this function name is called qcb.sortlist. So that's not something you've ever seen before, and you've never used it in Qlik Sense or Qlik View. You don't see it in the documentation because it's put there by the SSE. So notice that as I start typing or not typing, I'm getting the standard syntax check, and if I do a control space there, it will give me the name of this function. And notice it knows it needs 2 parameters, and now it syntax checks correctly. So the SSE, this is provided by this SSE, and I'll talk more about how we get this in here, but this is full, first class. It's adding it into the syntax checker and into the editor here. As a matter of fact, if I were to just do a control space after the QCB dot, I'd see all the various functions that my SSE has added into my product. So now I can go ahead and load this. And I've also shown down here, I've got this qcb.sendMail, where I'm just sending myself a message that says, hey, the reload is finished. I can put all kinds of functionality in this SSE. I'll go ahead and load. Notice it loads just normally. I'll go to the Qlik view. And if I come back here to my script for a moment again, I'm reading in something called a field called strn, string in, and I'm putting out something called sorted list. And sure enough, here it is. So here's the input, here's the output. So it's doing what I would expect from the script. But here's a chart down here, and I'll go ahead and edit the chart. So notice I can use this function just the same as in a script. I can use it as a chart expression. And like any other function, I can layer it up with standard Qlik functions, so it becomes a first-class function available to me. It's kind of a brief introduction there. And let me get my... Just got to figure out how to get back to the screen. There we go. So how does this work? Once again, I just add this into the language, and I'm going to talk more about that later. But I've coded up, in this case, in this slide, something called qcb.discount, and it passes in 2 parameters. My server-side extension gets these 2 parameters. It's the value of those 2 parameters. So in this case, the value of the customer ID and the value of the amount, does some kind of computation with that and returns the result. My server-side extension is not running in Qlik. It's not part of the Qlik product. It's sitting outside. It gets some parameters. It does something with those parameters. Qlik has no idea what it does and no control over what it does with that data. And then it returns some result. And the result goes back into Qlik, and in this case becomes a field. That's Qlik Sense or Qlik View, which is a very nice feature of the SSE. So anything I create, I can use in either product. How this actually works, how it's actually implemented, is we create the SSE, and in Qlik Sense or Qlik View, we define that this SSE exists. And we do this either through the QMC for Qlik Sense Enterprise, or through an ini file with 1 line with either Qlik View Desktop or Qlik View Server or Qlik Sense Desktop. And we specify SSE plugin is the keyword. We give it some prefix that we're going to reference our SSE functions with. And this is arbitrary. So this could be QCB, Rob, my SSE, whatever, comma, and then the destination. Where should Qlik find or talk to the TCP port? So what host and what TCP port? In this case, it's localhost 1001. This is the only thing we need to tell Qlik to enable this SSE and make all the functions that are available in that particular SSE at localhost 5051. This is all we have to do to tell it, hey, ask this SSE, connect to it, find out what functionality it has, and go ahead and use it. The server-side extension itself can be written in any language. and it can run on any hardware. Whatever the destination is here, this is the server, this is the port. So we can specify the server and the port. This could be written in Python over here and running on the same server, local host, the same as the Qlik Sense server. It could be some other server in your organization. It could be written in C#. Maybe it's running on Linux up in the Amazon cloud. It can be anywhere. Or it could potentially be on the network of a business partner that you're reaching through a VPN. So maybe it isn't even your hardware. It's something that somebody's letting you have access to get some functionality or some data. So the server-side extension piece itself, this piece of software that you write or a vendor writes for you, or you use one of the open source implementations, has two major components to it. One is what I'm going to call the plumbing, which handles the TCP communication. And that communication protocol is the gRPC, the Google RPC message protocol. It's a common protocol that's developed by Google and published as open source. So this first bit of plumbing is handling the communication, doing standard TCP socket stuff and using these, encoding and decoding these gPRC messages. It's also then routing to the requested function. So when it decodes this message, it says, oh, this user wants to run something called reverse string, and here's the two parameters it provided. And then there's the function implementation. So this is going to be specific to what function is requested. It's going to receive the parameter data. That's going to be common to all the functions, and then do something with that data. And then return some results back to the plumbing that's going to return it back to Qlik Sense. So the message protocol between here is formally defined through the gPRC protocol. You know, how does a function get passed in, and what does it look like when it comes back? So I have a project on GitHub here under github.com/robwunderlich qcb-qlik-sse. I'll talk about that a little bit more. We'll look at that repo. It's based on a NPM package or another repo, another GitHub repo written by Mirjam Drek called qlik-sse. And this is he describes it as an NPM package that simplifies the creation of Qlik of SSEs in Node.js. So it's written in JavaScript, meant to run on Node.js, and he takes care of all the plumbing, half of it. And frankly, that's the hard part, at least from my perspective. You know, that's the more complex part. And he's a much more talented developer than I am. I just put together this little shim, if you want to call it that. It's about 60 lines of code that says, okay, I want to write functions that are, you know, interface with this plumbing or take advantage of this plumbing to talk to Qlik. I don't want to rewrite the plumbing over and over again. I just want to write my functions to do my business logic, if you will. So I just wrote a little piece that lets you write these functions as JavaScript, separate JavaScript files, and drop them in the functions directory, and they're automatically discovered and become part of this SSE. So really, that's all I packaged together, that and some documentation. So I put a bunch of functions in here. My intent in creating this was more of a investigative thing. I wanted to learn about SSEs. I also thought, based on my experience with QlikView components, if any of you have used that, that was the idea, is let's pull together subroutines from the community so we're not having a bunch of pieces lying around. Let's share some best practices. This was also the same idea. It says, hey, if we're going to have regular expressions, why should everybody have a separate SSE? Let's have just a bucket where we can put these things and share them. There's been some interesting contributions to them. There is also documentation that's generated. And if we go up to that documentation, we can see what is already there. Things like creating dimensions and measures using script, a bunch of string things like encoding and decoding URIs, things that sometimes you just regularly need to do in Qlik, in script, encryption and decryption, and then some examples for the various types of functions that you can write. So there's some example code in there. I don't think that's a question. I think that's there we go. So there's a bunch of them up here and documentation that are created in this SSE. So a little bit about the nomenclature and SSE. There's quite a bit of doc that I'm going to kind of review quickly later, but I want to hit on some of the high points. So in the SSE, we can provide functions that we want to execute. So for example, something we may make up called reverse. This is an arbitrary name that we're going to make up. And it's predefined in the SSE. We define it as the developer. And it has some rigidly defined parameters and a rigidly defined return. We're going to say reverse takes in one string parameter and it returns one string value. You can't actually return more than one value in this way, but you have to declare whether it's a string or a numeric. You have to declare the number of parameters that it takes in. So it's rigidly defined. We can't make it up on the fly. There's also a set of functions that evaluate an arbitrary set of programming statements. They're called the script functions, like script eval string, and there's a bunch of them that take in, whether they take in strings or numerics or duals, but they're all just variations on the same flavor. And in this case, they take in they take in pretty much a single parameter followed by some variable parameters that come with it. And it's generally a entire little script snippet on itself. By script, we don't mean Qlik script, we mean script in the programming language that we're targeting, in this case, JavaScript. So it's really an arbitrary set of programming statements. It could be a whole program. I've got examples that, where I've got 50 JavaScript statements. To do this, to use these functions, they have to be explicitly authorized in the startup. It's generally considered to be dangerous to do this because you're passing in an arbitrary set of statements that you have, as the designer or the administrator of this SSE, have no idea what it does. It could actually shut down your SSE. I could figure out how to poke around in the code or do that. So, it's kind of a special use case, but it's possible. What's also interesting is that this code doesn't have to be anything in particular. It just means that it goes into this bucket that gets passed to the SSE that says, hey, evaluate this, do something with it. So maybe it's not JavaScript, right? Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's COBOL and it gets run through a compiler. But both of these formats of functions, predefined functions, and the open script can be used from both load script and chart expressions. There's another syntax which is really interesting, which is the table load. And if you've looked in the load, the help for the load statement in the last few years, we can load from files and we can load from inline and auto-generate. You may have noticed a new keyword in there called extension. And this is a syntax in the load statement that a from location is an extension. They call it an extension, which means a server-side extension. And we point to a function in the SSE. In this case, I've used the prefix mySSE. Some function, and then we pass it parameters, which is the name of a table, in this case, stocks, and a field. So let's say that we have a function that, given a list of stock symbols, returns to us a table of quotes for those stocks for the last 2 days of each stock, so a 2-day period. And rather than just returning like a value, like what was the last value of it, it returns an actual table with multiple columns, in this case 4 columns. So I've loaded up some symbols here, 2 symbols, and then did this load extension, and this produces an entirely new table. So rather than just returning a result, I'm returning an entirely new table. The asterisk means give me all the fields, from the source. In this case, my source produces 4 columns. I could specify the names of specific columns, just like I would if I was pulling it from a file. So this is really an interesting thing in that we don't even really actually have to pass it a parameter. We can pass it null, and it knows what to do and go off and get its data. So we can think of this like a connector, in that we can go off like we might use a REST connector or any other kind of connector, Dropbox connector, to go off and get data. What's interesting about this and what's nice is, again, we don't have any restrictions on what this actually does as far as Qlik is concerned. As long as it follows the protocol for passing the messages back and forth, it can do anything that it wants. So what's an SSE good for? I almost left this slide off because what I want to do today is kind of go into more of the imagination, but I can tell you some of the things that I can see it's being used for currently. So first of all, things that can't be done or can't be done easily in Qlik. Regular expression string matching. We always did that in Qlik View using the module. We missed it in Qlik Sense. It's very useful and powerful to have it in there. It's hard to do. It can't be done actually directly in Qlik. I saw something recently, somebody posted a really interesting blog post on how to do some machine learning algorithms in Qlik. I thought it was intellectually very interesting, but really difficult to implement. Again, my compliments to the person who figured that out and posted it. But also we know from experience that R and Python come with some great machine learning packages. So we might want to just leverage those instead. Interfacing to other systems. So things that are difficult to get to. So we may have like a REST connector, but perhaps the Qlik REST connector doesn't support the specific kind of authentication that we need with that REST endpoint, something specialized. Or maybe we're going into a green screen system on an old mainframe or something. We can do whatever we want, get data to that. Or we want to leverage the processing power of our ERP. So our ERP, we want to pass in an order, and we want to pass back 600 columns of order detail. And we don't want to write a connector, we just want to be able to do that. And we want to be able to do that not only from the script, but maybe within the UI. So somebody enters an order ID, and we bring back these 600 fields or 500 fields and format them the way we want in a chart. Writing data back from the Qlik front end into another system, or maybe even data produced in the script. And then importantly, round tripping that. So if you've used some of the write back solutions like Infinity Forms, that's how they do that. They write that to a web service from a extension potentially. But how do you get that data in charts for other users who are currently using these same fields that you've written back? Well, if you use an SSE as a function to access that data, everybody can pull it from a SQL store instead of pulling it from the Qlik data model. Real-time data. So if there's something you need to get data faster, you can get that into your chart right away. IoT, Internet of type things. So again, it's kind of obscure data sources, whether they're real-time or batched in your script, you can do that. And just about anything else that you can think of. So here's a little analogy that I'm going to throw up here just as a memory aid. So if we think about this like a restaurant, we have Qlik Sense is the diner. We have a server, which is the SSE, the plumbing piece, and then the chef. What happens in the kitchen, how this is prepared, is the function implementation. We think about functions, that's something that's predefined, it's on the menu. The diner can pick from any of those things and can get an expected result, and the chef knows how to make those. The script is a recipe that you can pass to the chef. Here, please, can you make this? The chef may or may not be able to do anything useful with that. You can pass it to them, you can look at it, it turns out to be just garbage, or I don't have all these ingredients. You don't know, you're just passing it in. You got to be able to handle Do I want to let the chef make this? Do I need to pass back error messages that say why I couldn't do it? So another interesting thing is we have no idea what the chef does when we get in there, and no restrictions. So let's say you order a pizza. Maybe the chef doesn't make it. Maybe the chef goes to the pizzeria down the street, gets a pizza, brings it back, and passes it back. As long as it comes in on an order ticket and it comes back on a plate, we don't really care how it is. What this means is if we come back here to our plumbing here, we can write this in any language we want. This could be written in Python or C# or JavaScript. The function implementation does not have to be in the same language. And some of the implementations that Qlik has produced as samples, they are the same language. We got a Python server, we got a Python SSE that is executing Python functions in Python, and it's using Python for the plumbing. But we can use Python for the plumbing, and then we can talk to an R server and do this. Or we can have Python for the plumbing and to do some Python stuff and do some R stuff that's based on another server or running on another task on the same server. So the language that we're implementing things in, we have two bits. We have the plumbing, which is really just, hey, what's easiest for you to do? What do you know, or what do you have laying around? And the function implementation. And if somebody says, gosh, I have this Python SSE set up, and somebody says, I'd like to do R as well, you don't need a separate SSE for that. You just need in your function implementation to be able to run some R. Likewise, in this qcb-sse that I'm talking about here, it's written Node.js and JavaScript, but yeah, it could execute R as well. Anything you can launch from JavaScript, or more correctly, anything you can launch from Node.js, you can use as a function implementation. So that could be a call to a web service, that could be starting a task. Anything you can build the interface or the linkage between, you can use. So let's look a little bit at this documentation, how you get started. So there is a README up here. There's not a whole ton of documentation. This is kind of designed for people who are somewhat familiar, but again, not deeply familiar, but somewhat familiar with downloading a package from the internet and starting it up, running it in Node. So you're just going to download this and then do an npm install to pull down the packages, and then starting up this server, this SSE server. You've got a couple of parameters. One is to change the port that it's running on, and the other one is whether you want to allow script. The default is no. So if you want to allow script to run, you need to turn that on. When you build a function, there's only two requirements for that function to be able to participate in this SSE, and those are defined here, and we'll look at them a little more. But up here in the doc, it says this is an implementation of Qlik SSE, which is Miriam's project. I'm going to link over there. So Miriam has a lot more information about writing these functions, about SSEs in general. You don't need to do any of this Miriam stuff here. This is what I've done. But he does have some good discussions about the concepts of server-side extensions, about functions, the types of functions. There are the categories of functions, I should say, tensor and scalar. These categories are all just about how many pieces of input do you get and how many pieces of output do you get. They sound very fancy names, but scalar basically means I give you one input and I get one output. Okay, and by one input, I mean one row of input, could have multiple parameters. Aggregation means, hey, I'm going to aggregate together a bunch of parameters, like that's the way I might do a sum with a group by. So I'm going to give you a bunch of rows of data, and the SSE is going to return one value for me. And then tensor is one to many. So that was like that where I'm producing a table. It says, here's a parameter, and I give you back 20 rows based on that parameter. So he's got, again, some more great information here. And then he also talks about the server-side extension repo, which is the official Qlik repo. And they have, again, more information that's worth reading. They talk about now we're backing up more into the plumbing, what the communication flow looks like. And then they have a bunch of sample SSEs that you can download and run. So they have a Python example, in which case the plumbing and the function implementation is Python, C#, C++. And then interestingly, here's a C# one, and they wrote the SSE plugin using C#. They wrote the plumbing, wrote in C#. The function implementation is R. And the reason they did this is because R doesn't have or at the time of this writing, didn't have a gRPC package. So it was difficult to write the socket communication in R. So they just wrote it, like I said, you don't have to use the same plumbing and the same function implementation. They wrote the plumbing in C#, which was simple. And then they wrote their function implementation. They wanted to do R evaluation there. So there's a number of options here. So let's take a brief look here at this. So we've got some documentation. And so here is what I wrote. So this just wrappers all the hard work that Marilyn did. So it's really just 60 lines of JavaScript running in Node.js, mostly handling parameters. And it goes and looks in this functions directory and enumerates all these enumerates all the files that are in here and looks for the right signature in there. And if it's the right signature, then it registers it and it becomes part of the SSE. So to add a new function to this, if you were to download and install this, all you have to do is write one and go ahead and drop it in here. And when you write it, there's only two requirements that it has to have. It has to have this function config object, which gives it a name, a function type, and some parameters. And it has to have a constant called function definition. So these two names, these two symbols, then have to be exported through the module exports. And then what you do, and this is all kind of boilerplate. I put some examples in here, like how do you handle the input and the output, but then you can do whatever you want with the data. So that's all you got to do to add to this. There's some example files in there that have a lot of comments and some console tracing, so you can kind of walk through and see how they work. But then you may want to do one here, like here is one that does transformations of strings using a templating system. So again, kind of boilerplate stuff here, reading, figuring out, it handles JSON and CSV, but then does the work down here. So what you do can be complex or simple, but hopefully it adds some value to you. All right, are there any questions I can answer at this time on SSEs before I move on to the next topic?
So you should be able to unmute yourself in case you have any questions, please.
I can start with one at least to have the usual suspect asking questions, Christoph.
Okay.
Can it work on HTTPS as well?
You mean the communication, the socket communication?
Yes, the communication that encrypts gRPC protocol. I see that in the ini file or on the server, you're specifying as hostname and a port, but no protocol. So I'm assuming it defaults to either HTTPS or HTTP as the wrapping protocol, or is that a wrong assumption and GPRS is anyways?
I think it's a wrong assumption. I think it's a socket. It's just a socket protocol. I don't think it's not using HTTP or HTTPS, either one. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I think it's just socket communication, and it has its own. So the messages they're encoded. They're encoded in a binary form in GPRC for performance reasons, and you use a library to do the encoding. And I don't think there's an HTTP or HTTPS wrapper around that. In terms of like security, I imagine there might be different implementations of GPRC or some security layer wrappers around that to use basically SSL around that socket.
And if you're using a Node.js server, like the example of Miralem at the heart, and this is my kitchen on the other side beyond the plumbing, does this out of the box support like session multiplexing? Assuming you have many users and you're using this in the UI of a chart and you're generating some responses, can the SSE tell the different sessions?
It can. So there's some information that comes in. There is some information that comes in as part of the GPRC packet that identifies the application and the user that came in. So you can bind those, and they are bound on the return. So yes, you can multiple users out of the box. Multiple users can use the SSE. Without interfering with each other. Now, in the back end, you need to control or think about if you want to have multiplexing in terms of multiprocessing in terms of performance reasons. But the workflow, getting it back to the right user, is taken care of out of the box.
Thank you. More questions?
Okay. Question: is anybody using a server-side extension of any type?
I did. I mean, it was in my times when I was pre-sales, but and I did not since in my projects, but it's around. It is also production ready, let's say.
I will say one comment about, I think Qlik has done a less than great job about, I'm sorry, was there a comment coming in? I didn't quite catch that, Ariel.
So, hi, Patrick here. I would just like to say I use server-side extensions in Python, and we used it for some natural language processing. That is quite handy. What you already mentioned, what is maybe helpful for others, is to know the difference between. You showed two approaches: the literal script execution and this load extension in the load manager and the data manager. And I don't know if you said it, but as far as I thought, it is much better to do it, if possible, in the load script where this extensions loading, because then the whole package will be sent to the SSE, and if you use the in-script evaluation, you will evaluate every row by itself. So if you can pre-compute it, it's much more performance. The performance is much better.
Yeah, good comment. So the different ways of invoking this is there's differences in how the data is bundled coming in and how it's bundled coming back. And this is probably the most performant way. And that may or may not be important to you depending on your volumes. But there are some quirks to how the data is bundled and how it comes back, and some limitations. It kind of leads into one thing. I think Qlik has done a not great job on promoting or leveraging the SSEs. They're rather restrictive, like in the parameters, you can't have optional parameters. So if I define a function as having two parameters, I can't have a default parameter. The user has to put in two parameters, otherwise it gets a syntax error, and the syntax error won't make it past the load script. The load script will fail with a syntax error when it's running. So, you know, things like that. There's some performance things that I think could be tuned. So I'm hoping that Qlik will embrace a few small changes to make this easier for people to use or easier for people to understand. I think it's been primarily promoted as a way to do additional analytics and specifically Python and R. As Patrick talked about, you know, really powerful to pass in some data and do some data, particularly some machine learning or you know, data algorithms like classification, you know, that these products, other systems do very well. So I think that's kind of the way it's been promoted, but I think it's also really useful for some of these other use cases like write back, interfacing with your ERP, those type of things. So I'd like to see that be made easier, as well as kind of community-based or library experimentation like QlikView components of saying, here's some useful things that we'd like to see first class in the product, but let's prototype them and model them in an SSE. More questions? I know there's a chat panel somewhere. I don't know if there's any coming in there, but I can't see the chat panel. So I'll leave it up to Christoph to tell me if there is.
No, I looked at it. There are currently no questions in the chat panel either.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next topic?
Yes, I would say so, yes.
All righty. So thank you for taking the time to listen to me talk about SSEs and qcb-qlik-sse in particular. I hope you found something useful or stimulating in that. The next thing I'd like to talk about today is the new version of Document Analyzer that I've been working on. And many of you may have already used Document Analyzer. I would guess that quite a few of you have or been exposed to it. So Document Analyzer is a application code analyzer, static analysis for QlikView applications or Qlik applications. And I've been publishing this for no charge for years on the QlikViewQuickbook.com and the tools section, starting in 2009 with the QlikView Document Analyzer. That gathers information about a QlikView document and then uses QlikView to present that in tables and does some analysis and highlighting about things. Probably the most popular use of it is identifying unused fields, what fields are not actually used in your data or in your application, so therefore you can drop those fields and save some RAM. In 2017, I created a Qlik Sense version of it. And also got some help from Axis Group, a US consulting company, who used Document Analyzer quite a bit and wanted to chip in. So they've chipped in quite a bit of their knowledge. We sort of moved from the QlikView version being more of an experts tool. Here's just a lot of raw data to, in the Qlik Sense Document Analyzer, being a little more opinionated and saying through the process of using these flags, saying here's things you should look at. So that became how people saw Qlik Sense Document Analyzer. QlikView Document Analyzer, because I created it for myself, I always resisted making it give a lot of advice. I just said, well, if you know what you're doing, here's a way for you to get the information. Qlik Sense, with Axis's help, we tried to make it more of an advisory tool. It still requires that you understand quite a bit. Again, those get downloaded, sometimes up to 1,000 times a month, so I think they get used a lot. So let me do a demo of the product that I've been working on. So this is the newest version of the Qlik Sense Document Analyzer, calling it Qlik Sense Document Analyzer Pro. I started working on it with Sparos Kokanis, who immediately took a job with Qlik, so he had to stop working on this because of the conflict of interest. So his name is still on the website, but he was just giving advice. He can't do code anymore. And there was some problems in the Qlik Sense Document Analyzer. It was implemented as a connector, and so you put it in the load script and it would run and collect all these things. And the majority of the problems were around that the connector wasn't really designed, architecture is not really designed for you to open another Qlik app. It works, but you run into all kinds of problems around licensing and access and installation and multi-node systems. And for me personally, it was fine because I just do all my work on desktop. But everybody wanted it to run on the server, and they wanted it to run in the cloud. And there's many, many issues around getting that connector bit to work. And it was taking up a lot of my time trying to resolve those. And it was just a free product. So I didn't really have bandwidth to answer all those questions. So I decided to redo it from scratch. This is the Qsda Pro. After you install this, when it first comes up, it's going to ask you to manage the connection. You're going to define a connection type, which is going to point to your server. You're going to have to fill in the parameters that are appropriate for that type of connection. Right now I'm supporting Windows, NTLM, desktop, or certificate, and I'll have a SAS in here soon. Once you get the parameters set up, then you'll get a test connection button. It'll test the connection, you'll save that connection, and now you'll get a list of applications that are on the server associated with that connection. So here's the desktop. You can select an application from the list on the left, start an analysis. You can choose to collect calculation time, yes or no. Perhaps you just want to get the attributes like, what fields are in use, and you don't really care about chart calculation time, so you can speed things up by doing that. Once it's done, you can click View, and you can get sort of the familiar types of things you're used to in tables in terms of the names of the fields, whether it's been used or not, how many values in bytes, and then, of course, sorting and filtering capabilities against all that. You have some sort of familiar tools like the ability to do the drop field script generator, and you can do, again, some sorting on that and selections, and pick the ones you want and copy that in the clipboard, and then you'll have the script. So you've got these kind of familiar tables that would tell you, well, what's different here, there's a few things that are different. One is the connector architecture is completely different. We're not dependent on using we're just making a connection to the Qlik server, not using the connection architecture. We don't really care where you install this, as long as the machine you install it on can get through the firewall to the Qlik server, you're good. Right? So this could potentially be run as a SAS-based thing, but you can run it on your desktop. You can put it on the same server as your Qlik server. So it kind of that becomes less of a problem. The other thing is much deeper parsing of the data. So all the parsing in the Qlik Sense right now, Document Analyzer, is just done with pattern matching, looking for things. But so we don't really evaluate like variables and then evaluate the evaluation of the variables. That isn't happening. But now we have a deep parsing. So for this particular variable that is defined as $V margin B sales, we can see that it actually is using these two variables, and those two variables are using these two fields. So we know this variable, what fields it's using by going ahead and doing that. So we're trying to be opinionated. I say we, it's just me actually, but trying to be opinionated. telling you, you know, what things to look at and how to look at those things. And we're doing that based on these flag systems. And so we may come in here and tell you that, you know, you've got some problems, like you've got a missing key value, and if you click on that, you'll get more information up here. Or you have something that is a syntax error, and if you click on that up here, and you'll get information about that, and you can go and take care of it in the application. Once you take care of it, you may want to mark it as resolved. So you can mark things as resolved or hidden, and then they'll be marked off and filtered here until you bring them back if you want to see the resolved and the hidden. You can deal with entire categories of things, mark them as resolved or hidden. So let's say I've taken care of all my unused fields. I can just go ahead and mark off that whole category, and they're now hidden as they're done, and I can bring them back by doing that. So those same filters will also appear here when we look at each item like fields. We'll see all the associated field flags, and we can go ahead and mark those as resolved or unresolved. Also, there's a rich like hover that will tell you specifically more about that flag and give you the details of it, like how many bytes would you save if you did that. Various kinds of exports, etc. The detail on functions and some filtering, and the filtering works a little differently, and I'm kind of working through some of the filtering issues now. But if I wanted to find out, for example, you know, which charts used this one, by filtering to that, you'd say, well, it didn't just show that row. That's because nested in that, this V margin calc, it uses two other variables. So I want to keep those in scope as well, because you asked me to filter the selected. These things are in scope, and I can see that, okay, it's used in these two vises, and here's how it's used, and excuse me, and these three fields are involved. So I have some basic filtering in there, and it's kind of a combination. It's sort of like an associative filtering like Qlik, but not exactly like it, because I want to make sure that your scope stays. So in other words, if you filter on a field, so let's just go ahead and pick a field. I'm going to show you the tables that are associated with that. But in Qlik, we would only show when I expand the filtered field, but that doesn't make sense to me here. I want to show all the fields associated with this table. It's just that the table is associated with the field. So that's where that's at here. Again, in the admin right now, I'm going to have one connection at a time. I can just swap and point to another server. Potentially, eventually, you could have multiple connections if there was a use case, but I'm trying to keep myself focused here. So now we're in 2021, then this is going to be the new kid on the block. You can learn more about it by going to easyqlik.com/QSDA for QS Document Analyzer. And there's a button right there that says Get Early Access. If you do that, you can give me your email address, and I'll keep you informed on what's coming up. The schedule that I'm on right now is currently I'm doing a private or alpha testing with a few people. We're really trying to nail down what's the workflow, what's the UI going to look like, trying to knock down the big bugs. In February, I will be going into a private beta, which means that I'll be inviting some people who've signed up to try it out, something that's kind of a release candidate. But I've got something together that I think is ready to go to the market, but we'll be looking for shaking out bugs and finding edge cases from people testing, and going to get more feedback on usability. And then in March, roughly in March, we'll make a public beta where I'll just throw it out there with all the features, and anybody can try it and get feedback, and we'll again shake out the edge cases. And then hopefully by April have a general release that it'll be a commercial product. If this isn't going to be a commercial product, I haven't knocked down the pricing yet, but I believe there's going to be a free tier. It'll probably be limited. It'll have all functions, but it'll be limited, probably like in how many sheets an object should do. But like my QViewer product, if you've used that, it'll probably be relatively generous. And, my intent is to get it in as many people's hands as possible, that either through value they will be, choose to buy it, or they'll start to get into some larger cases. And then there'll be a couple of probably tiers of pricing, something that's geared towards an individual user or a solo consultant, and something that's geared towards the enterprise level, so everybody in the company can use it. So again, to be determined. I imagine it's going to be kind of along the same line as my QViewer product, not incredibly expensive. Although I think this time I'm going to go to an annual subscription. That seems to be what people want, and that will come with updates and support. Any questions or comments on that?
There's in the chat, there was one question from Nevo. Does the latest version of the Qsda also support the Qlik Sense September 2020 versions?
You mean the one that's currently on the website?
Yes.
Yes.
I believe so, but I'm not actively supporting that anymore. It's been a little bit of, I don't want to abandon people, but on the other hand, I'm one person. I've been spending all my time with the pandemic. I'm not visiting clients anymore. I'm spending all my time doing this. So I'm not checking out now. Access is still working on it, and they have actually given me a new version. There's going to be a 1.8 version. I just need to finish doing a little QA on it and packaging it up, and it'll be up on the website. But I have not tested it. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I ran theirs the other day against 2020. So is there a specific issue that anybody's having with the 2020 version? That would be a good question. To give a summary answer to that question, as far as I know, yes, it all still works. I'm not investing a lot of time in making sure that it does, particularly around the connector side. That's kind of a thing, to be perfectly honest. If it breaks someday, I'm going to say, I'm rushing to get the new product in place. I'm going to say, use the new product. It's very difficult the architecture of the old one is very difficult to handle all the variations in Qlik Sense installations.
There's another question coming in from Matthias. For using the Qsda with a local installation against the Qlik server, is there a need to open port 5001 on firewall? I think we've seen that in your URL.
The Pro version. No. Yeah. So yeah, no. So some more information on this. So the documentation is available online, so you don't have to have the product installed right now. If you go to help.easyqlik.com/QSDA, and it's just kind of coming along here. I don't have the deployment scenarios there. No, so the Qsda server, wherever you install that, if you install it locally, you went to my 5003, it uses some other ports. No, there's no opening. The only ports open here are whatever you would normally use to get access to the Qlik Sense server, which would be port 80 if you're using or 443 if you're using the NTLM, and 4747 if you're using certificate. So standard ports. If you put the Qsda server, this product here that I'm accessing, on the same server, then yes, you would need to get access to the 5003 in this case.
Does the document analyzer actually also look into the QMC settings and tasks potentially whatsoever on the that are configured for this app, or is it really in the app only? Let's say.
Yeah, currently it's only in the app. So Conrad's asked to annotate. So it's currently only looking in the app and one app at a time. Potentially, it could look at things like QMC or even usage of the app from logs or other sources. But for the time being, my goal in this first release is to give an improved version of what the goal has been all along, which is for a developer to improve and clean up a single application at a time. I see Conrad's on the call. I know he's done some really interesting work around Qlik connections and a lot of interesting work in .NET. So this is a .NET application. Any more questions?
There's one comment asking if you can analyze master elements with Qsda Pro in charts.
Let me see. Master items?
Master elements
Yes.
in charts.
Yes. So right now, and again, there's kind of some edge things that we're missing in the current free version, and I haven't, I know they're there and I haven't gone back, but yes, here we have full support. The other thing I need to show here is we have history. So I can analyze, you saw me, I just analyzed this application, but I also analyzed it yesterday twice, and I can go ahead and pull back those histories. And it won't be in the first version, but shortly, thereafter, we'll be able to do comparisons between the two. So yeah, we'll be able to have here in the viz. Whether it's master viz, yes or no. Oops. Got some strange things going on here. So yeah, I'll be able to look at the master viz and be able to see what they use. And I'll be able to tell you, what resources are being used by the master viz in terms of, what variables and parameters, but also whether it's in use or not. So here's a use count. So here's 2 master viz that aren't in use, and 3 that have a single usage.
That's cool. Yeah. So you get some congrats in the chat from Konrad Matthijs, for example, Dan Koster. I'm not sure if I was on mute before, so I maybe repeat. So great work. One question also from my side: where's the calc time, the calculation time, coming from?
You mean where is it reported, or how is it actually calculated?
Yeah, either way, if it's reported through telemetry services that picked up from there, or do you estimate the calculation, or how does it calc time work?
Yeah, excellent question. So I actually calculate each object, and I figured out how to avoid the cache problem. So I don't get anything from cache. So I recalculate every object from scratch and run a timer. So
it's self-collected.
It's self-collected. So I go through and I calculate each object one at a time, and I run a timer. So it's somewhat affected by, the other load on the server, but again, in most cases, it doesn't matter because you're working in a QA environment, or, we're talking about relative numbers here. The fact that something took 110 milliseconds versus 90 milliseconds, we still know what kind of magnitude we're in. When we're working on something that takes 20 seconds, the fact that it took 22 or 19, we still know we have trouble. And we can also measure our improvements. Yeah, so that's the calc time that I'm doing there, and then reporting it. This one happens to be very, very trivial, but we can sort by calc time. This is milliseconds in this particular app. And see which ones we're working on, and more importantly, as we make changes, as we believe we make improvements, we can rerun and see that improvement and document that improvement. And with the history, we can go ahead and show that improvement. And I know sometimes I want to do things like just look at unused fields, and I have an app that's really big, and collecting calc time perhaps takes 15 minutes. It's not QSDA's fault. That's just because, that's the size of the app. So maybe I just want to uncheck that on this next run and only get that. So in which case I will suppress the calc time information.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
And that was another thing that I've sort of fixed here or improved on is the original one. You're going to get cached results, so you have to bounce the server or your Qlik Sense desktop if you want to, get timing between runs.
Cool. Yeah, that's definitely a good indicator for tuning apps. Well needed.
Any more questions?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment, no.
Okay. So just to kind of give you one more pitch on that or one more review, if you're interested in following more, easyqlik.com/QSDA. And
Already signed up.
button there, and I'll have your email, and I'll push out some emails in the coming months telling you about status, inviting you to a private beta or public beta, soliciting feedback. There is also a community which you can find or link to in the. So there's a community.easyqlik.com as well. It's not real active right now, but that will become more active as we start doing public betas. There'll be more discussions there. Okay, so this is also a discussion of QViewer, my other product, as well as Qsda. Well, thank you all for your time today.
Rob, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for all the good insights you brought and on the two topics. And we will share the link for the recording. And we hope we can see you again in some of the upcoming meetups. I'm sure there's lots more to share. You could if you wanted to. And I also hope that this year will allow us to meet, although it doesn't look very likely that there is going to be a physical event somewhere in first half of the year where I can travel to the US, but who knows?
Yeah, so let me mention one more thing on that topic, which is the Master Summit that some of you know me from or have attended. So the Master Summit was twice a year, once in the US, once in Europe, a 3-day advanced training. Because of the COVID, we didn't do it last year. We're hoping to maybe do it this fall. We'll see. We're all in the same place that we all are. We like doing the in-person thing. But in the meantime, we are presenting some of the material online as a way to stay connected, and because there's the demand for that. So that's something you might want to keep an eye on when, Christoph talking about meeting in person. Maybe we'll meet in person next fall, but in the meantime, mastersummit.com. If you'd like to do some online classes, they run about 3.5 hours each. I'm doing scripting, advanced scripting, January 20th, which is this week. So some more information there.
Rob, may I ask you to send me the slides as well so we can put it on a drive?
Yes, I will do that. I'll do that right after the meeting.
Yeah, the one question, if you may want to look in the chat, also from Matthias, if there are any new formats or subjects planned for the online Qlik Master Summit.
So what we're doing right now is presenting the same, the same material and almost the same format that we've been presenting in person. So hands-on with exercises and sample files and lecture with breaks for exercises throughout. We've tuned it, we've tweaked it a little bit to make it work, better online because we don't have, proctors in the room and that kind of thing. But it's pretty much the same thing. We've talked about where to, whether to do different formats or additional material, but we very much have enjoyed the in-person thing and feel like there's a lot of sort of video and online content around Qlik. So that's been something we personally enjoyed doing and hope to do again. Feel like there's some benefit, the networking that goes on. So at this point, we haven't really invested in doing anything really different there, except offering what we did in person virtually. And again, each year, I don't think if we go back to doing in person, I don't think we'll continue the virtual classes. I can't say I'm only one of the group. I can't say never, but I think it's primarily the in person that we feel is our niche. If there's particular topics that you would like to see covered in the Master Summit, please drop me a line or use the contact form on the Master Summit page. I know that many people have talked about a lot of, we did have this API track that was going on with Nick and Sparrows, and a lot of people, wanted to see more in that. But, Nick already runs at webzy.io and webzy.academy, already runs a full set of online courses around that. So we're not going to try to replicate that in the Master Summit umbrella. We have had lots of questions about, wanting to do more administrative stuff. Again, the challenge there for us in the in-person is it becomes, only part of the audience is interested. And we try to present things that apply to everybody. Performance tuning, scripting, data modeling, everybody has to do that. So some of those specialty topics, that is something we may come back to and offer as an online virtual thing and separate from the in-person.
Maybe something around the new stuff coming in the analytical model that is new since September, I guess, or was it July that it first was a part? Is that what's the practical examples, use of it?
Yeah,
I haven't seen it in projects so far, so I will be interested.
Yeah, so what we have done at the Master Summit, if any of those of you attended in the past, a lot of times we'll do like at lunchtime or evening sessions of kind of like reviewing some of these newer things that our experience are playing, or sometimes getting a speaker from Qlik or somewhere else who's had experience with those technologies. There's some really interesting things going on with Qlik. I find that they kind of come in fits and starts, and now and then it's like the giant wakes up and, oh my gosh, look at what we're doing. I'm fascinated by this merge statement in the that's coming up in the February release. I think one of the interesting things we've all wanted very much is the ability to, over the years, is to update the model in real time. And years ago, we had that thing called dynamic update, which was a great idea, but it failed for technical reasons. This looks like perhaps another run at that. But that's a missing piece for a lot of us, particularly. Most of my work these days is around mashups and using the Qlik data engine rather than the Qlik front end. And in that case, the Qlik just becomes a database with a very nice selection engine. So real-time updates become more important.
Okay, so I think we can wrap it up here. That sounds interesting, and yeah, we will communicate the next dates. We don't have them now ready, Bernhard, I think, that we need to discuss, but it will be somewhere in 4 weeks from now. And we keep the 3 to 4 weeks cadence.